Hello and welcome to this history podcast. Today we're going to carry on with the aims and motives of the Big Three. Now, to recap, the Big Three were contained up here in this picture on the top right. As you know from the previous podcast, we focused first of all on Georges Clemenceau, who was the leader of France. And the other two of the Big Three are also in this picture. We have to the right the President of the USA, Woodrow Wilson, and the Prime Minister of Great Britain, David Lloyd George. Now, today's video is going to focus not on Woodrow Wilson or Georges Clemenceau, but on the man to the left, circled now in red, David Lloyd George. Okay, so where we're going to go and start with what David Lloyd George actually looks like. And here he is in the picture on the bottom left. Now, as I said with Clemenceau, the way to remember Clemenceau is his bald head and big bushy moustache. David Lloyd George has a full head of hair and also has a moustache. So that's the way you can differentiate between the two. Also, he might be referred sometimes as the Welsh Wizard, as he was from Wales and was also seen as a pioneer, a reformer in the British government at the time. Now, where do we start with David Lloyd George's aims and motives? So, like Clemenceau, before the Paris Peace Conference kicked off, there was a main agreement between the Big Three, and their main thing that they could agree on was stop war. They all wanted to stop war, as World War I had been the bloodiest, worst war of all time. But obviously, they all had different ideas on how to do this. Now, we've already looked at Clemenceau, and I'm not going to go through him again, but David Lloyd George was very different to Georges Clemenceau, and he had very different ideas of how the Treaty of Versailles should look and how the Paris Peace Conference should turn out. So the best place to start is with his motives before he came to the Paris Peace Conference at the beginning of 1919. Now, as I've said already, World War I was the worst war of all time. And the main thing of the conference was to avoid it ever happening again. There had been a huge loss of life, and parts of Britain had actually been bombed during the war by huge German Zeppelins that had come over in the middle of the war. Now, it hadn't been destroyed anywhere near as much as large parts of France had been destroyed, but there was a lot of anger from the British people, and most of the British people demanded some kind of revenge against the Germans for what had happened in World War I. Now, if you look at this poster up here, it is of British propaganda, and it is displaying the kind of public opinion of Germans at the time. At the top, it says, "Once a German, always a German." So the view was, even though the war had ended and Germany had given up with the armistice in 1918 and they had gone back home, there was still this feeling that that the British people should not forget what the Germans had done during World War I, and they should be punished accordingly. As you can see in the poster, we've got German soldier bayoneting a baby. We've got them torturing prisoners of war, and also their leaders on the right being disrespectful towards women and drunkards. And the view was that the British people shouldn't forget how Germany had acted during World War I with their U-boats, which had bombed innocent civilians during the war. So there was a huge sentiment that Germany needed to be punished. Now, unfortunately, David Lloyd George did agree and disagree with this. But we'll come to that in a minute. So just to recap, World War One was the worst war of all time. There was a huge loss of life, and parts of Britain had been bombed, and many people of the British Empire did demand revenge. So David Lloyd George, before going to the Paris Peace Conference, had to take that into mind. Now, also at the same time, he wanted to make sure that his British Empire was protected and make sure that it was kept the strongest in the world, no matter what. Britain was a huge empire at the time. He wanted to make sure it was still going to be big and strong as it had been before World War One. Now, the problem with David Lloyd George's, as I've said, is that a lot of British people wanted revenge, kind of on the same scale that the French people wanted revenge. But he realised that there was no point in completely and utterly making Germany pay. So if we move to his aims now, he said he would make Germany pay. But a lot of people say that he said that because he knew that's what the British people wanted to hear. So when he came to Paris Peace Conference, he was saying that I'm going to make Germany pay. But was he just saying that to kind of appease the British public? But just because he wasn't going to get full revenge against Germany doesn't mean that he didn't want some kind of justice. Okay? It's not that he didn't want revenge, it's just he wanted justice. And he wanted to make sure that the peace was not too harsh, as he felt it would just cause another war in a few years' time. So basically, the best way to remember David Lloyd George is that he was acting as kind of a halfway point between Clemenceau and Wilson. Clemenceau wanting to be extremely harsh, and as we'll look next time, Wilson, who didn't want to be harsh at all. So, also, as I've said about the British Empire, he wanted to make sure that it was protected, but also he saw an opportunity here to expand the British Empire. Germany had colonies during the war in Africa and in Southeast Asia, so he was seeing the chance now to perhaps expand his empire. He also wanted to maintain control of the seas, as Britain had the largest navy at the time, but also wanted to increase British trade by maintaining British control of the seas. Now, if he wanted to maintain Britain's trade, he also had to make sure that Germany wasn't too harshly punished, as he wanted to keep it a stable country who would still trade with them. So, if we look at this quote here, David Lloyd George is saying, we want peace, which will be just, but not vindictive. Above all, we want to protect the future against a repetition of the horrors of this war. And this was him speaking to Parliament just before he went off to the conference. So remember with David Lloyd George, yes, he had similar motives to Clemenceau, as that he wanted to avoid war and he wanted some kind of revenge because that's what the British people wanted. But he also wanted to make sure his punishment for Germany was just and that it wouldn't create another war in years to come. So if we compare it to also what up here, this quote from Lloyd George, we propose to demand the whole cost of the war from Germany. The whole cost of the war from Germany. So I want you to just realise David Lloyd George is the man in the middle. He wants a just peace, but at the same time gets some kind of revenge for the British people against Germany. But I think a main thing to remember with David Lloyd George is that he wanted to protect the British Empire. He wanted to keep the empire strong, to make sure that his navy was the best in the world, and to make sure that he was able to trade with lots of different countries. So there's David Lloyd George, the middleman. The best way to remember him is as the middleman with the middle way. And I'm going back to this quote here at the top like I did with, it's the same quote that I saw with Clemenceau. So this is David Lloyd George when asked how he thought he had done at the Versailles Conference. And he said, "Not badly, considering I was seated between Jesus Christ and Napoleon." And as he says himself, he felt he was the middleman in between, where Napoleon was Clemenceau and Jesus Christ was Woodrow Wilson. So what we'll be looking at next is Woodrow Wilson, and trying to discover why this man down here, David Lloyd George, was calling Woodrow Wilson Jesus Christ. Thank you.